Okay. Um, so, did anybody else just join us in the last minute?
I did.
And?
This is Kim Armentrout from the Library of Virginia.
Oh, hi. How are you doing?
Doing fine, thanks. How are you?
Good. So I wanted to do a quick check just to make sure that we're not missing anybody here. We have somebody on the phone from Carnegie Library, Daniel. Is that correct, or he's soon coming back?
Correct. I'm back.
You're back. Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to mute myself
Library.
so that you don't hear my chatter in the office.
Okay. And Jennifer from Connecticut Library Consortium.
That's right.
And we have people from DC Public Library.
Yep. This is Megan.
Okay. Anybody from the Free Library of Philadelphia? Okay. Greenwich, Connecticut.
Yeah, we're here.
Yes, Stephen and Barbara.
Okay. IMLS, Sarah Fuller. Okay. Kim from Library of Virginia.
Yes.
Anybody from Rutgers? How about Saratoga Springs, New York? Okay. The Ferguson Library.
Yep.
Let me see. Sally Reed from United for Libraries. Westchester Library System. Somebody just join us?
Yeah, this is Marion Parkinson. Hi, sorry to be late.
Okay. And you're from Free Library of Philadelphia.
That's correct.
Good. Okay. We might be joining for a few others. I got an email from Haley Rich in Cuyahoga County that she wanted to join this call instead of tomorrow's. But briefly, the purpose of these calls is, well, we've got two things going on. We have these monthly calls, and these are really just open space for people to talk about, what you've been doing, what you've been learning, the implications of what you've been learning, so you can learn from each other. A lot of this time is spent with really you talking and me looking for learning points that I can basically call out and point you in a direction of looking at. So this is really an open space for you folks to share with each other. If there's something that's really specific to your library, we can take that offline. And I think, does everybody have my email address?
No.
No? It should be, well, I'll tell it to you real quick. It's just C. Sears at the Harwood Institute. So just C, S-E-A-R-S at theharwoodinstitute.org. So this is really sort of the what you've been doing, what you've been learning, and if you have something really, like I said, specific, this library specific, we can take that offline and talk about that separately. But today's focus is on, what have you done since the lab with what you learned? What experiences have you had, and what questions has it raised for you? And before we get into that, I want to do just a quick check. I'm glad Mary Davis is on the line here. You should have all received an invitation, I believe, for ALA Connect, the listserv. And if anybody hasn't, could you just let me know who that is? I've got one person, Alice Knapp.
I did receive it.
You did? Mm-hmm. Okay. Everybody else has it?
Yes.
I don't think I got it.
Do.
This is Dan from Pittsburgh. I don't think I got it, or it didn't make it through my spam filter.
Okay.
Dan with Kim from Library of Virginia.
Okay. So Kim from Library of Virginia, you don't either?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Megan from DCPL as well.
Okay.
Carlton, this is Jennifer from CLC. I had a question about a housekeeping issue. They had talked about updating the list of attendees because a lot of the addresses were personal or the emails weren't correct, and resending that list out, and I haven't seen that yet.
I got let me check on that. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll put that down as a to-do and check on an updated list.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other housekeeping items people have?
I wanted to ask, it's Barbara at Greenwich Library. Are we going to have this every first Tuesday of the month, including over the summer?
It's every second Tuesday,
Yes.
and so the next one would actually be January 14th at 1 o'clock, and it's every month.
So that includes July and August?
As far as I'm concerned,
Okay.
yeah. What have you folks been doing since the lab, and what has your experience been?
Hey, this is Dan from Pittsburgh. I could go.
Yeah.
Well, so we have a specific project that's transitioning out. We did a storefront library in a neighborhood that is sorely in need of amenities here in Pittsburgh. And the project was set to be finished in March. So we're transitioning now to a second phase of the project with other community partners. And so we have on the calendar now 3 community conversations that we're planning to do to inform that transition process.
Oh, nice.
Oh, so when are they scheduled?
They're in January. I'm hoping the webinar is before then because otherwise I'll be winging it.
Yeah, so the webinar is scheduled. Let me look real quick. I can tell you.
January 21?
Yeah, January 21.
Okay. Yeah, so maybe if you could give me the crash course beforehand.
Yeah, so when's your first one scheduled?
January 8th.
January 8th.
Yeah.
All right, this is Jennifer again. I have another housekeeping issue. I didn't get any, or didn't see that I got any notice about the webinar date. Did I miss something?
It's at the bottom of the list of these sessions.
Okay, then I
Last
didn't.
item.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Hi,
So
this
you've
is
got
Mike
3
Culver in
conversations.
Saratoga Springs. Just wanted to let you know I'm here with Chris Alexander, and we've joined the call.
Hi,
Oh, good.
Hi.
Great. So, Dan, you were talking about that you have 3 conversations set up?
Yeah, well, we have the time and everything scheduled, and the invitation's about to go out.
Okay. So let me ask you, in terms of how did you go about inviting who you invited and why?
Sure. Yeah. So there are certain the people who are involved in the project all have different connections that they've made just by being part of the neighborhood. So I asked all of my colleagues to submit 10 to 20 names. So actually what I did was I practiced. I did a little my attempt at imitating what Rich did at the very beginning of the training with my colleagues in my department. And then after they saw that process, then I asked them to submit some names, and I sat down with some other one who has pretty deep knowledge of the neighborhood, and we sort of grouped the people together in what we thought would be a good mix of people who are community members, people who work for nonprofits, and people who are otherwise involved in the neighborhood, and then and also we had to make sure that we grouped people who wouldn't fight with each other because there's those tensions, and we put them all sort of in 3 groupings, and then got their contact information, and we're having people call to invite people.
That's super. So you went back and did the aspirations exercise with staff members.
That's right.
And how did that go for you?
It was good. The timing couldn't have been better. We were at that transition period where I think everybody appreciated having a chance to step back and look, take a long view rather than think about day-to-day operations.
Mm-hmm. So has anybody else had used any of the tools since the lab, and what's your experience been?
I have. This is Kim from Library of Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
I used, for our New Directors Institute, 3 tools. One was the Public Knowledge Waterville case. Another one was the aspiration sheet. And then finally I used the Public Knowledge Mad Lib. With the Mad Lib, that was actually really popular. I know we didn't go through it in the session, but the directors really seemed to like it. It kind of validated what they already knew about their library communities and made it fun for them.
You were here.
That's great. The so this new director's workshop, about how many people were in that?
We ran 2 courses, 10 people in each, and this was just a kind of a follow-up to their initial training, so it got them focused on a more outward trend rather than just worrying about their day-to-day operations.
Uh-huh. That's great. Anybody else?
This is Barbara in Greenwich. Every year in December we have to submit to the town an operations plan, which really is a summary of our goals. And so I met with 2 of the managers to have to go through the aspirations exercise, which would, I hope, give us an opportunity to really step back and think about goals within a much broader perspective. And the timing was wonderful. We had a wonderful conversation, particularly when we did aspirations for the community as opposed to thinking about aspirations for a particular group within the library. And at the tail end of the conversation, both of them thought it was just terrific to have had an opportunity to have a general and broad discussion as opposed to, very task-oriented discussions, which are often the reason that we meet. And so I felt it was, and they felt it was, a particularly successful opportunity to get together and talk about broad aspirations.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
Yep, this is Alice. I used the turn outward exercise with the supervisors. I gave them a brief description of the Harwood Institute and what my 3-day training was, and then said that I had to do this exercise and that I thought they would like it. And they were just like me. They wanted to know, what did the score mean? But it turned into a really great conversation about not only just looking outward more towards the community, but looking outward to other departments. It really, I think one of the supervisors came up and said, "Can we do this exercise at the next staff meeting?" So I was encouraged. And then I've had my first I'm calling it an innovation hub, the kitchen table conversations with staff, talking about what they learned and how is it applicable to the library. It was so great. I can't, because it was, how I termed it is what they learned like in webinars and in their professional reading, but they also brought to it what they're learning from the community. And we're going to be changing some of the, we walked away with 3 mini groups to look at different ways to do things. And the first of those mini groups is meeting right now, and they're in shock because there's not a supervisor with them. So it was really great. My second innovation hub is tomorrow morning. So it was just, it's a very positive experience, and staff are really energized by it. So I'm hoping that to continue it. We're doing it one a month, and we're alternating days so we can get people from different shifts involved.
That's in the Innovation Hub?
Mm-hmm.
That's great.
Yeah.
This is Jennifer
Anybody
from
else?
CLC. Yeah, this is Jennifer from CLC. I was going to say I feel a little bit of a laggard in that I haven't used a couple of the tools, but the one thing I implemented immediately is that our staff meeting format changed to have the first thing, instead of the usual check-in where people get into the details and start checking off their what they've accomplished. We're starting the conversation with what have we learned. And so it's a starting point with me sort of modeling initially with what I sort of learned at the Harwood Institute, but I didn't have the time to go into the exercises yet with them for various staffing reasons. So that's on the docket for January.
So a number of you have used the aspirations exercise, And I'm just curious, you've used it in lots of different ways, and I'm wondering if this sparks any questions for anybody else or sparks ideas for anybody else in terms of how you might use it.
This is Ike in Saratoga Springs. We've used the aspirations exercise in, we've been having meetings with all of the departments, and Chris is here with me, and between Chris and Gina and I, we've each been taking turns leading, moderating the discussion and taking notes, and we have our last department meeting this Thursday we're going to do it with, and then when we're finished, once everyone has more or less had a chance to do it with the group, we're going to assign everybody who works for the library to go out and do the aspirations exercise with one person in the community.
Oh, so like that, the on the street type of thing.
Exactly, but we're not making them stop people on the street, although because some people are. Chris, for example, is really great at that. She has no fear, but there are some other people who we're going to maybe let them do it at home over the breakfast table or something. But we're going to ask that everyone who works for the library has some conversation with a member of the community.
This is Eric at DZ Public, and we're going to take a similar approach to this. We've done probably 2 or 3 sets of the aspiration exercises with staff members here at DCPL through different working groups that we have for service populations. So we have an adult services group, a teen services group, a children's services group, and meetings for managers and senior executive staff. And so we're doing the aspirations exercises across that whole strata, and our plan has been to take some of the data that we get out of those conversations to kind of drive innovation labs based on coordinated interests.
I have a question for the people who are, like, I guess this is Alice, but other folks. Do you feel like there was a certain order that you felt more comfortable using the tools? This is Jennifer, sorry.
I'm thinking. I did do the prescribed questions as indicated, and I felt that if I didn't, it would not have flowed. And the other thing is that after I asked the first question, I had to wait a good 20 seconds and be really comfortable with that quiet before, and I could just tell that they started to do what happens often in brainstorming sessions. And one person has an idea, and somebody has a totally different idea, and they just sort of blurt out their ideas. But then it turned into, after that happened, like 3 separate ideas, it turned into a really great, rich conversation. So I was very, very pleased with it. But I did feel, even though the book said, ask these questions in this way, trust us, I was weakly trusting and was prepared to move things around, and I didn't have to. And the questions really, really flowed the way they were supposed to. The turning outward, I thought about doing the aspirations with the supervisors first, but I decided to do the turning outward one because it was a quick exercise I could do at the beginning of a meeting. And we had just done a lot of the aspirational stuff with our strategic plan. But I think if we hadn't had just done that other work, I would have started with the aspiration.
Versus the turning outward.
That's, you rate yourself on whether you're more outward or internal. And that worked really, really well. And all the wonderful ambiguities that we found when we took the exercise, they had the same ambiguities as well. Mm-hmm. And so it turned into a really good conversation afterwards as well. And it was a good one to do because the rest of the meeting was very task-oriented and task-driven. But when they left, they were like thinking about their tasks in relationship to the community and the relationship to the other departments.
Well, that answered another question, which I wondered whether you could combine it with a regular meeting or whether you really felt that the tools needed to be the focus of their own gathering.
So I'm curious from the experience, the collective experience that people have already had, what do you think about that question?
This is Marion at the Free Library of Philadelphia. I just, this past week, had a meeting. It consisted of members of 18 different neighborhood organizations, very grassroots organizations. All these people were coming together for the first time. They all work in roughly the same neighborhoods. And I chose to use the not so much the aspirations questionnaire, but the community one. What kind of community do you want to live in? Those questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually, because we didn't have a lot of time in the meeting, and there were other things that, there were things that we needed to accomplish. So I actually gave it out as almost a written assignment at the very beginning for people to do while we were waiting for everybody else to arrive, with the promise that, I was going to, so there was no discussion involved. It was purely a writing exercise for them. But then I brought them back and I've compiled them and sent them out to everybody, and I've been hearing from people how excited they are about the results of those. And it actually, them having done that exercise at the beginning of the meeting, I believe, steered much of the conversation that we had during the course of the meeting, even though it wasn't directly related to that questionnaire.
This is Chris. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, you go
This
ahead.
is Chris in Saratoga Springs. We did it with, as I said, with our departments, adult services, children's services, et cetera. And we found that it took a half hour of the meeting. So it took a big chunk out of their staff meeting, but half hour pretty much from start to finish wrapped it up. And the other thing I wanted to say was we found that the answers to the questions were really fairly uniform among very different groups of people, including our operations cleaning people and our adult services and our children's services. It was really astonishing, actually.
So in Saratoga, you've done this with a lot of the staff across the organization?
That's correct.
We have, yeah. And
I'm just curious. I'm curious if you would speak a little bit to what have you noticed as a result of that?
I would say it's a watch and wait. People were interested, but they're waiting for the other shoe to drop, I guess.
Because we are, at this point, we are not quite sure how we're going to use all this information. What I thought was pretty interesting about the whole thing, because we've also, between the three of us who attended, we drew names out of a hat and had the conversation with our board members too, one-on-one. That it was not hard at all. We thought it was going to be tougher, or I did anyway, to steer the conversation away from the library to a bigger picture of the community. But it was not at all. People were kind of eager to talk about it.
Which exercises did you guys do in Saratoga?
We just did the aspirations, or whatever the ask exercise, which has one additional question, I think, from the aspirations exercise.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So in doing all this, what questions have surfaced for people?
I think there's a lot of now what. We're gathering information, and now what's next after this.
Mm-hmm. So somebody, I think it was Alice, you talked about using innovation space. That's what, there's actually a tool about that, but you're calling it innovation hubs.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about what's happening in that space, and what are you talking about, and what are the implications of it?
Well, because it has the word innovation in it, they all came, the Children's Department came with the robot that was made at a recent program, and people came with big ideas, and then I think probably their biggest surprise was that we were talking about really nuts and bolts types of stuff, like how can we expand services. I saw this webinar on outreach. So now how can we expand our services to this community and that community? And one of the things that in particular the reference librarians were saying is that they're seeing people more coming in more and more for one-on-one time, and that our attendance at some of our computer workshops is actually decreasing a little bit. so one of the things we're going to do is do some outreach to the senior housing and senior center with like a sandbox. And that came directly out of it. And I really was, we didn't plan it there. 3 people were assigned to follow up and work on that. Mm-hmm. And the other one is that we have teen volunteers, in the children's department, but couldn't we, have teen volunteers throughout the library? So there's another team out there working on that. Mm-hmm. So it was a lot of it was really nuts and bolts stuff and not really great ideas. The one tomorrow, I think we're going to talk a little bit more about maker spaces because I think I drove them nuts. They wanted me to be prescriptive and say this is what we're going to do with the maker space, and I turned it on to them and said, well, what do you want to do? Mm-hmm. And we decided as a group to all go out and read a couple articles on maker spaces and then come back and talk about it so we could work it into our program of services and not just have this adjunct thing of a maker space. Mm-hmm. So it was really, I was surprised, when I saw all the robot come out and everything, I really thought they wanted to drive the conversation into what would typically be innovative, and then when we actually started talking about what we had learned, it was all nuts and bolts stuff. Mm-hmm. But one of the other things that just as a side effect is our organization is very hierarchical. The staff is just loving that they can talk together and in between departments, and the supervisors and library ones and library clerks, and they all have access to me, administration, and they're really feeling listened to, which is nice. It's mm-hmm. And it's changing the dynamic a little bit around here in a good way.
Great.
Yeah.
Could I put a question out to the group? This is Dan from Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
I've gotten almost universal pushback to the term aspirations, which I understand is important. I wonder if anybody else has had that experience, and what kind of workaround? Because otherwise, everybody loves it, but that seems to be the sticking point here in Pittsburgh. What is the sticking point about the term? The people do not think that it will resonate with anyone who isn't maybe isn't thinking about without the context, I guess, of the rest of the training and the Harwood method. The word may not resonate with the public.
We've had a little bit of that with using the ask exercise that doesn't actually use the word aspiration. It says, what kind of community do you want to live in, which is also a little bit awkward. And so people say, what do you mean? And so we, or at least I do, wind up saying, like, what's your ideal community, that sort of thing. Aspiration is a pretty aspirational word if you're talking to the man on the street, I think.
So I'm just curious of other people's experience. I mean, it sounds like a lot of you have been using the aspirations exercise. Have you run into any difficulty with that?
This is Eric at DC Public again. The only kind of comment that we got was that the definition of community was unclear. But one of the things that I did with that exercise was I had people start as a written exercise and then to have a discussion after they had had time to think about it. And so some people commented that the stuff that they had written didn't really jive with the larger conversation, but they added to the larger conversation regardless. So there was kind of some confusion in that sense.
So one of the things, as long as you brought up this thing of definition of community, you probably recall when we were at the DC Public Library, that came up in our group. What do you mean by community? And of course, people can define that many, many different ways. And one of the things I'd encourage you to think about is how you define community can be used for very strategic purposes in having conversations themselves. And what I mean by that, let me just give you an example. You could define community as your library staff community. And what kind of community do we want as a library staff? And you're going to end up having a conversation that's very much about what kind of library does the staff want. You could define community about like a neighborhood, like Dan's going out and doing these conversations in the neighborhood. That's going to be, they're going to be defining maybe their neighborhood as their community. And the thing that's interesting with that term is, think about having it defined with whoever you're working with for a very strategic purpose of what you're trying to gain a better understanding of.
This is Megan, also from DCPL, and I did the aspirations exercise with a different group of folks here at DCPL. And as we got into it, they had that same question of, well, what do you mean by community? And I said, you know, I'm intentionally not defining it. It's up to you within the context of this exercise to define it. And that was interesting for me, partly because as I observed the group, it was very interesting to see who had gone with, you know, the very narrow definition of, you know, my little corner of the world, and who had gone with a really big, like, the whole world kind of community definition. But I wanted to do it that way, you know, as we're sort of experimenting with this exercise, partly because I think if I give them a narrow definition, it will in some way limit the kind of things we'll think about. And where we're in a place where we don't want to box ourselves in with traditional ideas of what a library can be or do, I thought if we had a more wide-ranging discussion, we could then zero in on, okay, within that context, where does the library fit in? And it worked pretty well. There were definitely some people who were like, oh, you wouldn't tell us what it meant. But I thought on the whole it worked pretty well.
Yeah. So I mean, that point about having people answer it for themselves is perfect, because it's very commonly that one of the first things people ask is, well, can you define it for me? And them defining it for themselves and making it something that's real, that's relevant, that they can relate to is really the important piece. So you can use it for those broad conversations, just like you were saying, as well as very specific ones. I was wondering if I could flip back to Kim real briefly. You used some of the public knowledge Mad Libs and public knowledge Waterville exercise with the directors, I think you said?
That's right.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about using the case studies with a group of people and how that went for you.
Okay. Well, we have found that our directors love case studies. They love to hear problems from someplace else and get to try to problem solve what's going on. So they really, really enjoyed walking through the Waterville case and throwing out ideas of what they could have done better. Everyone absolutely hated the slogan, "Still Your Community Hub," which was funny. It lightened the mood for everybody. They came up with some really good ideas about what the issues were. We didn't focus so much on the intentionality test. I kind of left that out until the end and then just listed the intentionality bullets for people to know after. But we covered the issues, what's really going on, and what would you do in this situation, and what would you be thinking about. So it was very popular to use that, especially because these are people who are already involved with library things and understand the bigger implications. I'm not sure I would have used this, or I would use this with, say, a neighborhood meeting, just because they wouldn't realize all the issues going on. But for library professionals, it was a great exercise to use.
But it's the type of thing that some of you that have been using these things with staff, you might use a case study as another way of working through a specific challenge.
Can you talk more about that, Carlton? Because I'm stretching to figure out sometimes the challenges are so specific and finding the case study.
Well, I'm thinking about the Waterville case in particular. If some of the case studies that you had in the lab one of the things that I noticed is just the way that people responded to the use of time. People really liked small groups working on a specific challenge with some of the tools that you had gained at the lab.
Okay.
The interaction that takes place in a small group over applying some of these things to an example it seems to be a place, not just with librarians, but with others, where there's a lot of energy and a lot of insight gained. There's a lot of learning that takes place around those case studies. And that's the only thing I'm really lifting up is a lot of times people will use the tools, and you need to use the tools and get used to them. But I love the idea that Kim actually brought in a case study and had people apply aspirations and think about the aspirations in context with a case study. It's another way of allowing people to learn how you might apply some of these tools to what people actually do.
Kim, how much time did it take?
For each exercise that I did, I gave about half an hour, and that was plenty of time, maybe in some cases almost too much time.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm. Other questions that have surfaced for people as you've been using some of these things?
This is Kim again from Library of Virginia. Carlton, I have a question because I've got a big project coming up. I've been asked to do neighborhood assessments in the next year, 9 of them exactly. And it looks like the first Learn and Apply webinar will cover community conversations, and it includes a how-to workbook. So will that help me as I start the neighborhood sessions?
Let me ask you a question. What is your time period for those?
It's going to go from February through October, and we'll be doing 9.
Yeah. So, you know, we could talk about this a little bit separately if you want, but my inclination is that, yes, it would be helpful.
Okay.
The community conversations, and that's the first one of the webinars. And the thing that you'll need to go with that is the following one on theming and using what you apply. But between those two, I expect that you would find a lot that would be beneficial in doing neighborhood assessments.
Okay.
Yeah. And just so you know, I've made note that Dan needs that sooner than later because he's got 3 of these coming up. So I'm going to look into when that toolkit will be available so I can get it out to people so they can see it.
Thanks, Carlton.
Yeah. Other questions that have surfaced for people?
Carlton, this is Barbara. I have a question about an upcoming meeting that I'm not responsible for calling. It's a gathering of about 10 to 12 individuals within the community who are interested in digital learning. And the library has been invited to that table with the schools and some other organizations. Have you applied these exercises as a participant, where you're not responsible for the agenda, but you would be providing input? Can you imagine using any of these exercises in a very subtle way?
That's a great question. That's Alice.
Yeah, so I'm just curious. I do want to respond to that, but I want to see if anybody has thoughts on that before I do.
It sounds like stealth Harwood.
I could imagine a meeting like that starting out possibly asking people why they're interested, what brought them there, which could lead you to say what your aspirations are for being there. But I'm not sure that question will be asked.
Wouldn't it be
Other
interesting
thoughts?
if you asked that to be included in the introductions?
Could be.
So one thing I can suggest to you, if you look at these tools and the questions in them, and not just as you can use them as a tool with all the questions combined, and there's a flow and sequence to them that makes sense, that's very natural. But if you almost start looking at those questions as things that you can use, and I love the word stealth because that's really sort of what it is. It's how can I apply some of these questions in a very stealthy kind of way to get a conversation that I'm in to go a little bit deeper. And you can use it like that, and you don't necessarily need to be on the agenda, so long as the agenda is, you know, open and you're allowing for discussion. But some of the questions about that get at the why, that underscores the what that people often talk about. You know, typically meetings are very task-oriented. A lot of these questions really get sort of at the purpose and meaning that underscores that. And a lot of times they don't get asked. And I would encourage you to think about where can you insert some of these questions into meetings where you can cause the conversation to go a little bit deeper and link it back to community and what your group is trying to achieve that serves the community. And then, you know, has the community been defined? Does everybody at the table have shared aspirations? You can find ways that are very stealthy to use some of these questions and make conversations and meetings go a little bit differently.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I would encourage you to try that, and we could talk about what your experience has been.
Mm-hmm.
My experience has been, I've seen this work in libraries, I've seen it work in churches, I've seen it work in all sorts of organizations, and sometimes just asking one of these questions at the strategic right time shifts the entire conversation of the meeting.
Which is, and it's switching it from saying, well, what's our overarching goal? You know, I mean, I think that's the whole, I can see that happening, where if you use the word aspiration, it pulls it back from a already visualized outcome to allowing more different ideas to come in.
So I want to flip back to and point something out that Alice raised. You're still on the phone, Alice?
Oh, yeah, I am.
So you were talking about using innovation hubs.
Mm-hmm.
And I would encourage you, it's a webinar that it's not until I think the third one. We call it Hosting and Using Innovation Space. But I would really encourage you to think about what Alice had to say about having these spaces where people get together and talk about what they've learned from these things, taking an hour to do that. Taking time early on to get the people that have been doing some of these conversations to get together and talk about what have we learned and what are the implications of what we have learned. And do it once a month, take an hour to do that. Organizations so seldom take time for reflection. Most of their meetings are about doing things. But create space for having a time where people can talk about what have we learned and what are the implications of what we've learned. That's what we're going to be talking about in that Innovation Space webinar, but there's no reason that you should wait on doing that, because a lot of, like you were saying, what's next, a lot of the what next comes from getting together and talking about what have we learned from these conversations, what are the implications from what we've learned. And very quickly you'll start to identify that there are behavior changes and there's things that you can do with what you've learned. And that's the what's next. Does that make sense?
Well, you can't see me nodding my head.
Carlton, I found that my staff had a hard time because the what have we learned, they needed a prompt because they all had different experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So to kind of anchor it around a particular event, even though in general it was from time to time our goal is to sort of figure out what are we hearing. Mm-hmm. So that was something I struggled with initially, was that there was kind of like, oh, haven't learned anything. And then it was sort of reminding people, well, gee, you visited so-and-so, you know. But I don't know, does anyone have any thoughts about that? I know, Alice, maybe you've had the most experience with that.
I actually think this is where the beauty of their question is so vague that it allowed people to just think about what was on their mind and allowed them to bring separate things to the table. But I did set the stage and say, whatever, whether it's professional, journal reading, webinar, whatever you've learned, we're going to be talking about.
And they knew it was on a certain subject, or it was broad?
No, it was really broad. It wasn't on a certain subject.
And so you've been asking that question, this is Ike, about what have we learned, not about conversations you've had with people in the community, but about other studying, et cetera, that you've done in between meetings?
Yep. And it ended up, they ended up talking about the community, but we haven't done our community conversations yet. But when I saw that the innovation space, it just clicked with me, because we spend a lot of time learning our craft and in webinars, and no one comes back around and says, so what? That was great. You spent 2 hours in that webinar. What are we going to do about it? And I thought this was a perfect forum for us to have that conversation and those things that really stuck, to do something with them. But they ended up talking about the community and what they're seeing in their day-to-day practice of their art. So it was really good. Now, eventually, as we start to have our community conversations, that's going to be folded into this as well.
Right. So, in Ike, in your case, where you've had a lot of different people do aspirations exercise, you might think about bringing some of those people together and taking an hour to talk about, well, what have we learned?
Right, and that's exactly what we plan. I mean, Chris may not know this, but I've developed. I'm plotting in my mind here what we're going to do once we've had people do this. Try to at least start informally, so that we don't necessarily gather the same. So we broaden beyond department meetings and maybe have more mixed groups of people to get together informally to talk about what they're learning from their conversations. Because, as Chris said, we're I guess more surprised than anything about, no matter who we're talking to in our organization about their aspirations for the community, there are a lot of similarities.
Mm-hmm. So I didn't want this to go by without really encouraging people to look at that innovation piece and think about being able to look back in 6 months at your calendar and say, did I find time to set up 1 hour a month aside to actually pull people together and say, what have we learned? And it could be with all those webinars that you're investing in, or it could be in aspirations exercises, or it could be community conversations. But taking that time out, being able to see it on a calendar, to talk about what have we learned, what are the implications of what we've learned. And typically at the end of that, what we advise doing is put up on a flip chart someplace, what are the most important takeaways that you've had from that conversation. And quite often you'll also come to a realization that there's somebody else that needs to know what you've learned. So that's another question that's important, and we'll get into that in the webinar.
And that's something that we've sort of already discovered and have made a commitment to. A lot of things that we're hearing from our staff who are members of our community are about which there's very little we can do as a library, but we've committed to make sure that what we're hearing gets communicated to the people.
Yeah. So Eric, I'm interested in DC. You're going to be doing aspirations with different age groups?
No, well, different service areas. So, like, we have staff members that have adult services focus and children's services focuses, teen services focuses, and so we're trying to cross-cut across all of the different service populations and also with management and senior executive staff. So it's really trying to get a cross-section of the agency's understanding at this point and how our individual groups kind of think alike or differently, and how we can use the feedback that we get from the aspirations conversations to drive innovation in service areas that we recognize need to adjust or change.
Now, how many different people are going to be involved in leading and taking notes on these conversations?
So each of our working groups is about 25 to 30 people. So over the course of all of these exercises, we'll have hit probably like a quarter of the agency. So that's quite a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Are these conversations ones that several people are going to be guiding, or are you going to be doing this, or who's going to be doing that?
Each of us who attended the Harwood training is doing our different service populations. So Carmen is working with the children's services, Jamila is working with teen services, I'm working with adult services, Megan's working with branch managers, and Martha's working with senior executive staff.
And actually, this is Martha. Carmen and I sort of helped her a little bit. Carmen's out, which is why she's not on this call. She already did the children's services working group, and it went really well. The group was really receptive to it. I think it was a really good exercise. But like other people have sort of articulated already, I think there was sort of at the end of it this notion of now what, you know.
Yeah.
So we want to make sure that we follow up with them and get back with them.
Yeah, so one of the things that you might be thinking about is, you know, you've got a schedule for these and when they're going to be doing, is scheduling an hour of time for everybody that's been leading those, you know, the 5 of you that are doing that, to find a time to get together to talk about what you individually learned. And
right.
So you have that collective space of learning and then talk about implications. And you'll have, I'm pretty certain, coming out of that, key insights and ideas about who else needs to know, which is going to lead you to next steps.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we had even talked about the idea of possibly then having managers of individual libraries conduct the exercise with their own branch staff.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
We're getting...
You know.
Yeah.
And, of course, I drew the straw of working with the senior staff, so trying to get them all in a room when they actually are willing to commit time to it is proving to be challenging.
Mm-hmm. Other ideas or thoughts that surface for people? Or questions?
This is Mary Ellen Davis. I'm late to the call, so excuse me, but I could share what we're going to do with it at ACRL if you're interested.
Please do.
So we're going to try a very modified beginning step with Harwood approach, and at the ALA Midwinter Conference, we always have what we call a leadership council, and it's the elected chairs and vice chairs and the board of directors. It's about 100 to 125 people, and we have them in rounds. And so Catherine Dice, who works for ACRL and had the fuller Harwood training at ALA earlier this year, is going to do a webinar with a number of facilitators, and we're going to ask each table, so we're going to be in a big room at round tables, so each table will have about 10 people, and we're going to ask, what are your aspirations for ACRL? So we're going to try and set it as both, here's a tool you can start to become familiar with to try out in your own communities, and then ask to try and have a conversation about their aspirations for ACRL that will then inform us as the leaders about what we need to do to make the community more compelling. So we're trying it in a little bit different format than you suggest, but we thought we had an audience, we had a tool we could share. It could potentially go back to 100 different institutions, at least knowledge of and some beginning places. So it'll be a grand experiment. I can let you know how it goes on the February call.
Yeah. So when is that going to be?
It's at the ALA Midwinter meeting on Friday afternoon, which is like January 24th.
So if it would give you any degree of comfort, I've seen the aspirations exercise done like that in large groups.
Oh, good.
And it works.
Excellent.
I've actually done that myself in a group of about 250 people sitting at round tables doing aspirations. And that sounds like an excellent use of it. And I would point out for other people, we were talking earlier about how you define community and defining it in different ways for strategic purposes. This is a really good example of they're defining the community as ACRL. And they're going to open up a conversation about what do they want ACRL to be like. And that's a wonderful example of how you can use it.
Oh, well, good, because Trevor and I had that idea, and we actually talked to, I think, some of our academic colleagues around this call, too, Sarah and we talked to them, brainstormed about it while we were at the training in D.C., but we actually, sold the idea to the other presidents and thought we would give it a whirl. And, of course, we're spoiled to have Catherine Dice on staff, who's an organizational development consultant, and, again, had the full 4 days of the Harwood training already. So that will help us. And we're going to ask each board member to be a table facilitator, and we've invited our academic colleagues that were at the training in D.C., if they're available, to come and also be a table facilitator. So we hope that they'll be excited not only to have the conversation about the ACRL community, but the key message, or one of the key things I took away from our training in D.C. was this, the turning outward in terms of how they could think about working with their communities and listening to their communities, however they define it. Maybe it's the English department.
Yeah. So there's one of the things that I think about that I wanted to point out just as people were talking earlier, and it relates to having lots of different people leading conversations at tables that maybe have different levels of exposure to these tools. Somebody on the call early on said how they noticed that there was a 20-second pause and that they had to be comfortable with silence.
Yeah, that was me.
Who was it?
Alice.
That was you?
Yeah, that was me.
Yeah. So I'm curious, have others noticed that dynamic that's at play when you ask these aspirations questions about a facilitator needing to be comfortable with silence?
Yes, we have. What we found is that we've picked someone to go first, because there is that silence, and so we usually are able to identify the talkers in the group and have them warm up the rest of the people, honestly.
Thoughts from other people?
When I used it with the directors, I gave them a question and then put them into groups. So while they were forming their groups, they had time to think about some answers, and then they could start discussing it immediately. So it helped alleviate some of that heavy pause.
Well, and this is Mary Ellen again. I think a related issue to the pause, that I got some feedback from a person that was in a small group, not the Harwood approach, but just was supposed to be having a small group conversation. And the facilitator, I guess, was not as experienced, but it became every person making their comments to the facilitator reflecting back. So it was almost like a teacher in school. So I think anything we can do to help the facilitator engage with each other and not be always feeling like they have to provide an affirmative comment to a comment somebody at the table made. And I don't know if there's any tips you have to share to help people be comfortable doing that. Because I think it's related to that pause. If nobody's saying anything, then as a facilitator, you can feel pressure to jump in to keep things going.
So let me give you just a little bit of a... Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say that one of the things I noticed, because I had to run a larger group, is that you have to have the mics. If it's a large group, you have to have a large where people can be heard when they say it, because otherwise the facilitator has to repeat it because people can't hear the comment. And that forces that dynamic. And I know it's a really pragmatic thing, but it's really important.
So one of the things we're going to be talking about in the next in the webinar in January, which is the 21st of January, 1 o'clock to 2:30, I believe. It's on community conversations, and there's a large chunk of that webinar which is on how you facilitate these kind of conversations. So that very definitely is a part of it. But for those of you that are doing some of these things, like Mary, you've got Alan, you've got ACRL coming up, or others that Dan, you've got some conversations coming up. Think about it more as the facilitator is an intently curious person. They're really wanting to understand how people think about things. And that point you made about being a gatekeeper, where when somebody says something, the facilitator feels that they need to parrot it and maybe say it back to a group and summarize. If you can create a dynamic with 10 people sitting around the table where they're following the ground rules and learning from each other, but the facilitator is basically keeping them on track, making sure they're not wandering, keeping them going through the questions. But that gatekeeper role can really shut down a conversation and the sharing between people. The critical thing is being intently curious, wanting to understand how people think about things, and then listening for, the different ways that people interpret and define answers, and helping the group to understand what each other is thinking. You're trying to create a dynamic where everybody is talking and sharing between each other, but they're not talking over each other. We're going to be talking about that quite a bit on the community conversations, hosting and leading community conversations webinar.
That's great. Sounds like I'll be able to cram 2 days before we launch our big event.
Well, you weren't on the call maybe at the time, but Dan's got these coming up. January 8th, I believe, is his first, and I'm going to see if I can find the toolkit and send it out earlier. I'll see where that sits.
Oh, that would be great. I got to start getting these in my calendar.
Yeah. Other ideas or questions that have surfaced for people?
It's a housekeeping question. This is Alice. Mm-hmm. With the webinar, because I'm noticing it's on my calendar, but I also have a conflict. Is there a way to watch it afterwards, like an archived version of it?
Mary, are you still on the call? Mary Davis?
Mary Ellen Davis. Yeah, well, I'm Mary Ellen Davis, which is not the same person as Mary Davis.
No, I'm thinking about Mary Davis from ALA.
Well, I am. I just had to turn my phone back off mute. Yeah, it will be archived.
Okay.
Yep.
I thought you might have the answer to that.
It will be accessible.
Okay. Other ideas or questions that people have? Has this conversation sparked ideas for you about how you can apply these tools in some of the ways?
Yes. I actually think I'm going to go back and maybe do this is Alice, do the aspirational thing with some of this on department by department level, not cross department stuff. I think that might help in some areas where we might get the staff thinking as a whole a little bit and use it as a team building.
Mm-hmm.
Alice, do you feel that with staff's already done it across groups that it's going to be difficult for them to do it in there again?
Well, since I was really focused on what they've learned, and I haven't done the aspirational,
okay,
it'll be different.
Because that's what I was thinking about. We've done these gyrations of sort of think tanks, and we had a leadership conference at our state library or association where he sort of led what the aspirations for the group were, but not. And so now I'm wondering about going back in with the aspirations exercise with some of those same groups, and how, do you have to tweak it? I don't know. Carlton, do you have any, sorry to raise another question, but.
No, not at all. I mean, I'm just curious first if other people have insights or thoughts on this.
I think our experience, our most recent department was actually a combination of our administration department and our operations, which are the mechanics and the cleaners and the security people. And we did find that a lot of it was during a department heads meeting that all of the department heads have essentially gone through this with their individual departments. So it did get a little bit diluted, I think, wouldn't you say, Chris? It was so the more often you make people sit through it, especially in close succession, one after the other, the experience does get a little bit diluted.
Okay. What occurred to me, though, is as we were talking about using the case studies, is that I'm also wondering, when you say, what do you do with the information, whether we could take the information that we drew and came up with ideas, construct it almost like a case study, and now ask the group the questions related to the case study. You know what I mean? Which almost moves it forward more constructively.
So one of the things that I would encourage folks to think about is if you've done these with a fair number of staff, or you've done them with ACRL as a large roundtable discussion, that I'm going to come back to this point about taking an hour out for this, what Alice was calling innovation hubs. What we have in the guide is innovation space, and talking about, what have you learned from that? What are the implications of what we've learned? But then share with the people who've been in some of those conversations what it is that you've learned across the conversations. So like in Stanford, if you've done this with a lot of different groups, and there's a point at this of where you need to report back to people, this is what we've heard across the groups, because it reinforces the point, A, that you were actually listening,
Yeah.
right? Which you said which was so meaningful to people.
Yep.
But then when you start getting into the conversation around what are the implications of what we've learned and who else needs to know, that's going to start moving towards what do you do with what you learned. And if you go back and look at the intentionality tests about if you've gained knowledge about how people, what their aspirations for the library are, or ACRL, or whatever your context, share what you've learned and bring it back to people that can actually do something about it. And when people start to see actions that are rooted in their shared aspirations, they'll know that you're serious about this and that it adds up to something. It's not just having a conversation, it's sharing what you've learned from the conversation, harvesting that, sharing it with people that need to know, that can make a difference with it, and reporting back so that people understand that you've heard. Does that make sense?
It does, Carlton, and I guess that's why I was wondering if the case studies constructing your own might work. In other words,
I would go for it, and a lot of the case studies that we have in our workbooks have actually been drawn. The names have been changed to protect the innocent and all that kind of stuff, but they've been actually drawn from real life experiences.
Because I think when you go through the aspirations, you get knowledge, so you can almost take some of that knowledge, even though it's opinion, but some of it becomes fact, so you can put those in as factors.
Yeah.
And say, now what do you do with this mess, or
Right.
Okay.
I would go for it and try that. A lot of the case studies, like I say, came from actual experience, and that would be a really interesting thing to do in your own context. Applying what you've heard from aspirations, putting it into a case study, having people sort through that particular problem and seeing what they come up with. I'd love to talk about that in February or March.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Other ideas or thoughts that people have? You know, the main purpose of this time is really so it's a community that's learning from each other as they're beginning to apply these things. And the idea is that, you know, I can raise up particular points that I think are important to point out, but the idea is that you really learn from each other about how you're using these tools, and with the idea being that that's going to spark ideas for you that maybe you didn't think of, or ideas of new ways of, you know, going about it, applying it in your own context. Other questions or thoughts that people have? We've got maybe 15 minutes left. And the other thing I just want to let you know is if you do have something that is very specific to your library that's not really sort of a group learning type of thing, shoot me an email. And I think everybody has my email address.
I don't think we do, Carlton. Actually, it wasn't provided in any of the materials.
Okay, well, it's C. Sears at theharwoodinstitute.org.
Could you say that again, please?
Yeah, C. Sears at theharwoodinstitute.org. And I think there was maybe in the email that accompanied the notification for this, somewhere in the body of that email is embedded my email address. I'd have to go back and look it up. But at any rate, it's csears at theharwoodinstitute.org.
Oh, and I just found it on the participant list, too, that we were mailed with Andrew's notices of these calls.
Yeah. Yeah, it's at the very end of the participants list, I think.
This is Chris Alexander in Saratoga. You know, it occurs to me that, you know, we really haven't compiled the results of these aspiration conversations, and I think that would be one way to sort of to just keep the momentum going, and we haven't really done that. But has anybody had good luck trying to put that together and make it not just a big checklist?
Thoughts from anybody? Has anybody tried to go through and create themes out of aspirations conversations?
This is Eric at DCPL. So one of the things that we're doing is we have a shared Google document spreadsheet that we've been kind of coding the answers from each of our sessions. So we're each time we do the session, we add more data to the table, and we're trying to build categories of like collective responses out of that to help thematically create these innovation spaces around known issues.
Other ideas people have? So another plug I can give you is for the webinar that we're going to be doing, the second one. And I don't have the date handy. It's on theming and using public knowledge. And that is actually the topic. It's how do you create themes out of what you're learning and putting it into organizing it in such a way that you can use it. And just as a sort of a heads up, the webinar in January, which is on hosting and leading community conversations, those are conversations that have the longer questions. There's like 9 of them. They take about an hour and a half for these conversations. It's going to be real good to be able to actually have a community conversation before we get to the theming and using public knowledge webinar. And one of the things you might start thinking about at this point is Dan was talking about having 3 community conversations with neighborhood groups. You might be thinking about, well, who can we have a longer conversation, one of these longer community conversations with? And the first one is usually done in a safer because you're getting your initial reps at doing it. Sometimes they're basically an elongated aspirations conversation. They're not really hard, but sometimes people get nervous going in and saying an hour-and-a-half conversation. So you might be thinking about, well, who can I pull together, 8 to 15 people, sometime end of January and February, and have this hour-and-a-half aspirational kind of conversation with. Having the experience will give you something tangible to work with when we get to the theming and using public knowledge webinar. Do you have a question coming out of that?
I think we're just eager to know how it's different from the conversations we've been having already. So,
yeah. They're basic. Well, when you see the conversation toolkit, there's 9 questions. They go into a little bit more depth. You get really, you're going to want to get 6 specific buckets of information out of these, and those particular buckets of information or types of public knowledge become even more relevant in terms of making decisions about the things that you do. So it's a deeper level, it's a deeper conversation than the aspirations one. It goes into more depth.
We would hope so.
Yeah. Well, it does. And the tricky thing is, and I'll just lift it up and call it out, is getting 8 to 15 people together for an hour-and-a-half. You're going to want to be doing that probably the end of January, beginning of February. So as you're doing these aspirational conversations, and you find people, for example, that say, they find this really relevant and they enjoy it, you might invite them into a longer conversation that you would have in January or February. Anybody else have anything? So we have
I do have a question.
Call. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry, it's Jennifer. I was slow to digest that. Are you saying that the more extensive sort of community conversations, should you do the aspirations exercise with that group ahead of time, or can it replace it and expand it?
A lot of the aspirational conversation questions are included in it, but there's additional questions added to it.
Here's why. I was planning on my late January board meeting doing the aspirations exercise, but it's exactly the right size group and exactly the community I want to talk to. So I'm thinking that sounds like the right fit.
Okay. When is your board meeting?
The 31st.
The 31st. So I can tell you, and we can take this offline. You could send me an email or whatever. We could talk about it. But if you, the community conversation training is on the 21st of January. If you have, I don't know how long your board meetings are, an aspirational conversation you can get done in half an hour.
Yep.
The community conversation is typically an hour and a half.
Yeah, so that's not.
Yeah, so I mean, it's
okay.
There's more to it, but it also takes longer.
Okay.
Yeah. So anybody else have anything they want to raise? So we have our next call on February 11th at 1 o'clock. And like I said, there's going to be a webinar on January 21st on community conversations that I would really encourage everybody to participate in. It will be archived, but I can tell you that quite often people go through that webinar and they have questions they want to ask, and you won't be able to ask questions very well in an archived session. So try to join us in person.
Carlton, I have a question. I'm sorry, it's Jennifer again. Housekeeping question. The second Tuesday of the month would be January 14th. We're not having a conference call then?
Excuse me, January 14th. Yes, we are.
Okay, and then the following
Thank you
week
for raising
webinar.
it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and the following week is the webinar.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for reminding me of that. So anyway, this has been, it's super that people are using this stuff. That's absolutely wonderful. I would encourage you to continue to do so. The other thing I'd encourage is really think hard, if you haven't done this yet, about doing this innovation space, finding an hour to talk about what you've learned and the implications of what you've learned. And we'll be doing a webinar on that coming up this year. And in the meantime, put the dates down, because you really, as a group, you learn the most from each other. So being in this space where you hear what each other is doing is the best way of learning and applying it. Okay?
All right. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.